Welcome to the members and supporters of the Workers' Party of Britain, and to everybody else who's interested in our take on the very fast-moving events in Britain and, of course, abroad. I'm here every week at this time, every Wednesday at 8 p.m. I'm broadcasting to whomsoever is interested in listening to the take of Britain's Socialist Party, the Workers' Party of Britain. Common sense socialism. Not woke, not right on, not politically correct. Pro-Brexit, pro-unity of the territory of Great Britain. But we talk the language of the workers. We do what it says on the tin. So let me start with the events in the House of Commons today, which were bowling along quite convivially for Boris Johnson, the beleaguered Prime Minister of Britain, until the Right Honourable David Davis stood up with what he clearly hoped would be a Sir Geoffrey Howe moment. Those of you who study these things will know that Sir Geoffrey Howe brought about the end of the premiership of Margaret Thatcher with an intervention in the House of Commons, which was truly memorable. I like David Davis. I've worked with him on a number of things. He appeared in my film about Tony Blair. He's turned out to be a big critic of war and intervention in overseas affairs over now many years, and he's also a friend of liberty. But I have to say, I think his intervention flopped today. I think the coup against Johnson has flopped. I think there will not be 54 Conservative MPs putting in a letter to the 1922 committee demanding a vote of no confidence in Boris Johnson. And even if there was, I think there's no remote possibility of 180 Conservative MPs voting for it. And don't forget that as soon as a vote of no confidence has been taken and lost, then Boris Johnson is untouchable for a full 12 months thereafter. Now, of course, the fact that we're even having this conversation is ignominious, not just for Johnson, not just for the Conservative Party and its government, but for Britain. Britain is adrift in a sea of problems, not the least of which are international in nature, and I'll come to them later in what I have to say. But in a country where 180,000 people have died of the coronavirus, a country which has wasted scores of billions of pounds shoveled down the throats of Conservative cronies and party donors and even next door neighbours and local publicans of Conservative MPs and ministers, whose VIP fast track for the allocation of multi-billion pound contracts has just been declared unlawful by the High Court. We've got a government with a lot to do. We've got a country with a lot of serious problems. Build Britain better would be our slogan, but Britain is not being rebuilt at all by a government that is beleaguered and under siege over issues of parties and whether or not a trestle table and sausage rolls makes a work event a party, whether or not the number of glasses of wine and the distance between those clinking glasses was within or without the rules and regulations that the government had imposed upon the rest of us. Hypocrisy is a big issue in government. But it's not the biggest issue that we face. The politicians across the House of Commons are hypocrites, every one. One just crossed the floor today, or slithered across the floor. A Conservative MP for Bury South is now a Labour MP for Bury South, making absolutely abundantly clear how absurd our political system is. He was voted in as a Conservative. Now he's a Labour man, and the constituents of Bury South will get no say on the matter. It's high time that those who cross the floor in Parliament are forced to vacate their seats and test their new principles, in front of their own electorate in a parliamentary by-election. I challenge him now, the snake, whatever his name is. I've never heard of him before until I looked up his voting record today and discovered it's to the right of Genghis Khan. But now he's sitting as a new Labour MP, cheered to the rafters by the other Labour MPs, whilst Jeremy Corbyn is sitting on his own in the House as an independent, unable to get into a parliamentary Labour Party, that Genghis Khan's best mate is now sitting behind Keir Starmer at Prime Minister's Question Time. So I challenge the Labour Member of Parliament for Bury South right now to stand down and have a by-election. And I promise to be the candidate for the Workers' Party if he does. But the rebellion of the Conservative MPs had in any case, even before David Davis rose to speak, begun to run out of steam. My understanding is that only 12 Tory MPs have put in a letter demanding a vote of no confidence. That's a long way short of 54. And I understand that some that put them in this morning have withdrawn them this afternoon. That's my best information from inside the corridors of power. So we're stuck, it seems, with Boris Johnson, at least for the time being. That might look different after somebody called Sue Gray, who might as well be a character from Little Britain for all I know, brings forward her report on Partygate, but perhaps most particularly, the local election results in May will be pivotal in this. When I analyse the hue and cry that has been got up against Boris Johnson, of course I can see quite clearly what's going on. Dominic Cummings, a mistress scorned, has played a deadly game against his former chum, his former master. Boris, if he could have his time again, would no doubt make different decisions in relation to the feud which developed between his now wife, Carrie Johnson, and Dominic Cummings. I'm not saying that I would employ Dominic Cummings. I definitely would never have employed him. But if I had employed him, I wouldn't have dispatched him unceremoniously at my wife's behest out the door, carrying a cardboard box full of information with which he would damage me and my government thereafter. I'd have found him an ambassadorship somewhere nice and sunny, and I'm sure that Boris Johnson would do that if he could. When I look at the fact that the vast majority of the mass media, particularly the BBC, but not only them, who are deeply involved with Cummings in this attempted coup to get rid of Boris Johnson, I can quite clearly see the paw prints, footprints, fingerprints of those who've never accepted Brexit, never accepted the fact that Britain voted to leave the European Union, and never accepted the fact that the mountebank, the cad, the bounder, Boris Johnson was the Prime Minister to make it happen. I can see some of his opposition is to the right of him, and I'm not, again, surprised about that. After all, Boris Johnson isn't actually a Conservative at all. All these idiots who kept telling us that Boris Johnson's government was the most right-wing government Britain had ever had are obviously very young or very forgetful. The truth is that Boris Johnson and his cabinet are overwhelmingly Blairites. The British state has been Blairised. The Conservative Party from David Cameron onwards is a Blairite party, and the Labour Party is now equally a Blairite party. If a Tory can cross the floor with such ease and be welcomed with such joy, It rather makes my point, doesn't it, that these two parties are two cheeks of the same arse. You couldn't slip sixpence between the Conservative front bench and the Labour front bench. In fact, on some things, some public spending things, the Tories are to the left of the Labour Party. So it's inevitable that some people will consider that the Conservative Prime Minister is not nearly conservative enough on issues like immigration, the illegal arrivals at the south coast ports and so on, and other things, Northern Ireland and other things. So some of Johnson's critics are to the right of him, but most are Remainers, die-hard holdout Remainers. Now, for the avoidance of doubt, I said this last week, and tens of thousands of you know that because you watched it. We draw no distinction between the Conservatives and the Labour Party. We are against both of them equally. We are not in the business of choosing the lesser of two evils, even if we could discern which is the lesser of those two evils. In fact, we hold New Labour more culpable because the Tories make no secret of who they truly stand for, who they in essence represent, what they in essence are. Labour, on the other hand, pretends to be something that it is not and truthfully has never really been. It is a hyena in sheep's clothing, and our task as the Workers' Party is to replace Labour in the affections, in the loyalty of the British working class. That's a big job and a long march, as I put it last week, but we have already begun that long march, and well, it'll take some time for us to get there. It might take 100 years for us to get there, but a journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step, and that first step was taken by us when we founded the Workers' Party of Britain 2 years ago. Please check us out. Check out our 10-point programme. Now, Boris Johnson will now deploy some naked populism to get back on top. He has begun it. He made the right call before Christmas about the Omicron. Perhaps he'd listened to me a week before he did, when I said that based on my quite close knowledge of South Africa, I felt that the Omicron was the variant that we had all been waiting for and would bring about the end of the lethal toxicity of coronavirus 19. And so it came to pass. Boris Johnson will now announce one ending of a lockdown measure after another, and he'll be cheered by most Conservative MPs for doing so. Some Labour MPs will pretend to cheer, even though they have been egging Boris Johnson on all along to more and more draconian restrictions on the coronavirus issue. The deployment of the Royal Navy in the English Channel will be another populist measure that will be used because, quite frankly, most British people cannot accept hundreds and hundreds of people that we don't know arriving in dinghies and then being distributed throughout the country into hotels at the taxpayers' expense, possibly for years. The vast majority of British people can't accept that. Only Trotskyites and liberals and big capitalists believe that we should have no borders and that we should just allow into the country anyone who arrives here. And that's particularly true in a world that is dominated by the fear of Islamist fanatic terrorism spilling out from the wars which Western countries fostered and fomented, and civil conflicts fomented and fostered by Western imperial countries. Most British people will agree with Boris Johnson if he begins to reduce the number of illegal, mainly young men, arriving at beaches near you, arriving in hotels near you. He'll have to do something about this so-called levelling up. I don't know what that even means, levelling up, but he's going to have to put meat on the bones of it, and pretty quickly, because these seats in the Labour red wall that the Tories won, that gave them the 80-seat Conservative majority at the general election in 2019, are all at risk on the basis of the current opinion poll standings of the parties, which currently put a block of wood 12 points ahead of the Prime Minister Boris Johnson. So if I was him, I would be spending big on infrastructure projects in working class area. I'd be ensuring that Britain's notoriously low wage economy begins to move up a gear, so that the workers are at least better rewarded for their labours than they currently are. And incidentally, Boris, if you're watching, scrap this ludicrous idea of sacking tens of thousands of hospital, NHS and care home staff because they, for one reason or another, did not get vaccinated. I'm warning you now, that will be an exceedingly unpopular thing to do whilst you're carousing, partying about the ending of the pandemic, the ending of the lockdown response to the pandemic. Now, let me turn to matters international. This week, it was the anniversary of the partial breaking of the siege of Leningrad, the murderous siege of Leningrad by the Nazi armed forces and their Hungarian and some Ukrainian collaborators that were besieging the great city of Leningrad, now known by some as St. Petersburg. The siege was total. People were eating rats. People were eating horses that lay down on the street. People were starving to death in their tens of thousands. Perhaps 1 million people were lost during that siege of Leningrad. But the Red Army partially opened a narrow corridor which began, at least, to allow the supply of food and medicines into this great historic Russian city. The Finns, imagine, the Finnish army and their Nazi allies continued the siege for quite some time after that, but it was the beginning of the end this week in 1943 when that siege was partially lifted. Just 5 months later came the epic turnaround in the Second World War with the great victory of the Soviet armed forces at the Battle of Kursk, known as the greatest tank battle in history. But more importantly, the moment when the Nazi armed forces turned and began to run, and the Red Army chased them all the way to Berlin. You'll know where I'm going with this, but before I do, let me make an obvious point to you that nobody else does except the Workers' Party of Britain. Nobody else does. If not for the victories of the Red Army in the summer of 1943, the entire continent of Europe might still, in 2022, be under the swastika, be under the jackboot of fascism. Just think about that. Because you won't be taught about it. You won't see it very often on the BBC or in popular culture. And that's for a reason. Because in 1945 began the Cold War, when our government and its American counterpart and later us as the vassal state of the United States, had a vested interest in people hating Russia. And that required history to be rewritten. And my goodness, how it's being rewritten in the Ukraine. In the Ukraine, we are sending weapons to the armed forces of a government which rests on a base of neo-Nazis, of the Azov battalion, of people who carry the banners, literally, carry the banners everywhere they go, carry the insignia of Nazism on their uniforms, carry the banners of the Hitler fascist collaborators, the people who fell upon Ukrainian Jews even before the SS got there. People responsible for packing Ukrainian Jews onto trains to the death camps are now in the government in Kiev, and we, the British, are sending them weapons, which is a breathtakingly irresponsible and reckless thing to do. Because the air is thick, isn't it, with the possibility of war with Russia. That's the Russia that in 1943 turned the tide against Hitler fascism. That's the Russia that Mr. Churchill himself said had torn the guts out of the Nazi war machine. That's the Russia that the King of England, no less, presented a war sword to in recognition of their great heroism and the great role that they played in playing the decisive role in defeating fascism in Europe and thus perhaps the whole world. How did it end up this way? How did it end up that Britain, whose armed forces in toto could comfortably fit into Villa Park, the stadium of Aston Villa, is challenging the nuclear-armed, hypersonically nuclear-armed superpower of Russia, provoking them, poking them through the bars. Now, let me be blunt, because you won't hear this anywhere else. It's not Russia that's threatening us, it's us that's threatening Russia. Russia has no forces on our borders. We have forces on Russia's borders and the borders of Belarus. As a matter of fact, the British Armed Forces don't have enough soldiers to protect our own borders, but we're sending soldiers to protect the border of Poland with Belarus and of Ukraine with Russia. Work that one out if you can. The Queen doesn't have enough soldiers to properly parade in front of Buckingham Palace, but we've got enough soldiers to send them to Ukraine, along with heavy war material, including anti-tank weapons, which Britain flew there this very week. So recklessly provocative an act was that Germany, a fellow NATO member, refused to allow the British warplanes to enter their airspace because they were flying weaponry into what might soon be a war zone. Now, if your son or daughter has been sent by the British government into what might soon be a war zone, I've got news for you. It won't be a war zone for long, because Russia could take over Ukraine in days, if not in hours. Luckily, I believe that Russia has no intention of invading Ukraine and has never had an intention of invading Ukraine. But what I think is a very real possibility is that, egged on by the Azov battalion, egged on by the neo-Nazis, who increasingly are decisive in political and military events in the Ukraine, will invade the autonomous territories of the Donbass, of the Donetsk. Autonomy which was agreed to in the Minsk agreement, but which has never been implemented by the Ukrainian government. And Western governments have never forced them to implement it. There could very well be an attack on the people of the autonomous areas of eastern Ukraine, hundreds of thousands of whom are Russian nationals, and hundreds of thousands more are Russian-speaking Ukrainians. If there's an attack, a significant attack, there are attacks every day, have been since 2014, since the brutal coup overthrew the elected president of Ukraine, a Western organized, financed, and armed coup in 2014. They've been shelling every day. But if that shelling becomes an invasion by the Ukrainian coup state in Kiev on eastern Ukraine, on Russian nationals, then Russia will undoubtedly come to the defense of its compatriots. And then we will have a war. And then it would be exceedingly unwise for any British soldiers to be present on the front line of that war. Now, Blinken is meeting Mr. Lavrov in Geneva on Friday. We must pray and hope for sanity to prevail. But if it does not, then it's perfectly possible when I come before you at the weekend on the mother of all talk shows in Afghanistan, but at war that really can fight. Thanks for watching. Do let me know what you thought of any of the issues I've raised on my social media. In 3 weeks, less than 3 weeks of last month and this, 4 million people watched what I had to say, and many of them interacted with me about it. You're welcome to do the same. You'll find me on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram. You'll find me on Telegram. You'll find me on almost every platform that you can name. Do let me know. I may not respond to everything that you send, but I certainly read as much as it's humanly possible for me to do. Until then, I've been George Galloway on behalf of the Workers' Party of Britain.